take it away.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. As you mentioned, Garth Herman with the law firm of Gilmore and Bell. We're the county's bond counsel. So when it comes to public finance needs, we do a lot of work with both the county commission as well as staff in order to find the best way to get the county to the place that it needs to be. So obviously, some of you have been through that process in one form or another. Some of you have not. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of start out with just broadly, what are bonds and why would it make sense to do financing, and then to kind of get down into the weeds on some of it. I always like to also talk about, whenever I'm talking about bonds, I like it and I get excited about it and I understand what I'm saying, but that's not always the case with the people who I'm talking to. So if along the way, if there's something that I say that doesn't make sense, or if you need clarification, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me. I'm not going to take offense to that. I want to make sure that everybody kind of has a good understanding of what we're talking about here today. So with that being said, I was just going to start off with by generally talking about kind of the three main types of debt financing and why you might do them at the county level. So from a basic perspective, a lot of times we get a question of, why should somebody do finance? Why would you finance something as opposed to paying cash for it? Really, what that comes down to is state law. There's a concept called the cash basis law that was put into effect back in the 1930s during the Great Depression in order to help keep cities, counties, school districts, basically taxing subdivisions to help keep them solvent. And what that says is, in essence, that a jurisdiction cannot enter into a contract to pay money in excess of the money it has available on hand to make that payment. So in essence, when you sign that contract, you need to have that amount of money available to make that payment. If you don't, it could be in violation of the cash basis law. There are exceptions to the cash basis law in order to provide the ability to do financing in order to, basically take some of those what would otherwise be very large costs, spread them out over a period of years, still comply with the cash basis law. A couple of the main ways to do that is that if the county authorizes that project or that contract to be financed by a general obligation bond, that's an exception to the cash basis law. Likewise, if the county enters into a lease purchase agreement in order to finance that cost, and that lease purchase is set up for an annual appropriation so that it meets the cash basis law, that's also an exception. So those are the two main reasons why we often see, why finance is used for capital projects. It's because of that cash basis backing and in that law from almost 100 years ago now. And so that's why when we kind of get to some of these, it's good to kind of have that historical background on it. There are, generally speaking, about three main types of financing that the county may do: general obligation bonds, revenue bonds, or lease purchase agreements. Three different types. They're all kind of similar, but three different types. So general obligation bonds, that is a debt of the county at large. It's backed up by the county's unlimited taxing power to repay that debt. So it's extremely secure. It is a general obligation of the county. It can be repaid from really any source of funds that's legally available, but at the end of the day, if there's no other source of funds available to make that payment, then it's backed up by the county's taxing power. That's what makes it so secure. That's why it would also carry the lowest interest rate for the county's financing because of that security. Second type of bonds that the county may issue are what's called revenue bonds. Generally, the county does these types of bonds through its Public Building Commission. A little bit of background on the PBC. So it is an entity that was created by the county, and the county commission appoints members to serve on the Public Building Commission. The PBC issues bonds to finance projects at the request of the county. So in essence, it's an on behalf of issuer for county projects. The PBC issues the bonds to finance those projects, and then it leases those projects to an entity. Usually it's the county. In exchange, the county makes the lease payments to the Public Building Commission. The Public Building Commission uses those lease payments to pay the debt service on those bonds. So that's why it's a revenue. The PBC doesn't have any power to levy taxes or really to raise any revenue on its own. The only place it gets that revenue from is by leasing those facilities and then taking the rental payments to make that payment. So those are revenue bonds. They're not backed up by the taxing power. Now, if we move a step down, they lease those most of the time to the county. So the county has a binding obligation under that lease to make those payments to the Public Building Commission. So even though it's not a general obligation of the PBC, those lease payments from the county to the Public Building Commission, those are binding obligations. Those can be paid from any source of funds that's legally available from the county, including from the levy of property taxes. Now, this is one of those where the tax lid comes into play on Public Building Commission bonds. So, as you know, the tax lid came into being about 5 or 6 years ago, and you all probably know a lot more about the tax lid and how it operates than I do. And in my small neck of the woods, what the tax lid does is it could provide a limit on the amount of revenue from property taxes used to pay debt. So if the county has a general obligation bond, that is exempt from the tax lid. Tax lid doesn't apply to GO debt. If the county has Public Building Commission leases, the tax lid could apply to those leases. So any leases that the county entered into with the Public Building Commission before 2016, those are grandfathered in. So if you have to raise property taxes to make your lease payments, you can do that. Tax lid doesn't apply to those. Any leases that you enter into with the Public Building Commission after 2016, tax lid does apply to those. And so that basically puts a limit on the county's ability to increase property tax revenues if necessary to make the lease payments to the Public Building Commission only for leases entered into after 2016. In the county's situation, the last PBC bond issue that was issued on the county's behalf was 2015. It was a refinancing for Exploration Place, so you don't have any leases with PBCs currently that are subject to the tax lid. All of your leases right now are pre-tax lid, so they're grandfathered in. So 2 main types of bonds: general obligation bonds, Public Building Commission revenue bonds. The third type of financing that is available to jurisdictions in the state are lease purchase agreements. So a lot of times these can be done either for land or building improvements or for the acquisition of equipment or personal property. They are subject to annual appropriation though. So unlike a PBC lease, that's binding multi-year commitment. It can be a binding lease up to 50 years with the PBC. A lease purchase agreement, annual appropriation. So it's not a binding multi-year obligation. In essence, what that means is that every year a county has to enter, if you have a lease purchase agreement, then every year you have to annually appropriate and budget funds to make that year's payment on that lease. So long as you do that, it automatically extends for another term until its final term. Obviously, if you don't, that's legal, but it also means then that you're going to have to give up whatever the property was being financed by that lease purchase, and it'll also end up being a black mark on the credit rating of the county. So just 3 main types: GO bonds, very secure, binding; Public Building Commission revenue bonds, pretty secure, binding; annual appropriation lease purchase agreements, less secure because they can be walked away from at any time. Therefore, they're going to have a little bit higher interest rates and not as secure. Also not binding, subject to annual appropriation. Those are the 3 main types of financing that we've seen. As I mentioned, the county a lot of times has used its general obligation bonds in the past. It's used the Public Building Commission revenue bond for different sorts of facilities kind of located throughout the county that are still there to serve a public purpose, but may not be as advantageous for the county to finance on a general obligation level. And then the lease purchase agreements really haven't been used too much, but it is always something we like to talk about. It is an option that may be out there and available to the county. So that's kind of the big picture of the different types of financings that are out there. I'm going to quickly go through kind of the process. It's in essence a 3-step process to get from how do you get money in the bank, in essence, to pay for that project. So step 1 is kind of the project authorization phase. Our firm works with finance, works with public works to get a listing of the different types of capital projects the county may want to finance in the upcoming year. State law sets out different requirements for different types of projects as to what does the county have to do in order to properly authorize financing for those projects. So it's really important to have those meetings early. You know, if it's a bridge project, that's fairly simple, simply takes county commission action. If it's a road project, it may require multiple publications and a notice of protest period. If it's a building project, under the old charter, it had limitations on the location as to where that might apply, so then it might require an election otherwise. It might have to go through the Public Building Commission. So there's a lot of different things that we have to look at when we're looking at the projects being financed. So that's kind of step one. We get that information. Our firm prepares the necessary authorizing documents. They go up for consideration by the Board of County Commissioners, and assuming they're approved, the project is authorized. The county now has the authority to move forward, if it chooses to complete the financing for that project. Step two is the actual sale process. So this is where we work with county staff, work with your municipal advisor, Baker Tilly, to put together basically prospectus information about the county to help sell those bonds. There's a preliminary official statement that's used to help basically get the word out about the county, your financial operations, your economic outlook, basically your audit, your tax history, all the information that a prospective bidder might find useful when determining whether or not they want to buy these bonds. We also put together a notice of bond sale. Most of the county sales happen at what is in essence a public auction. It's a date-specific. Banks, if you want to bid and buy these bonds, you have to turn in your bid by a certain time on a certain date, and then the books are closed and those bids are evaluated. So in the notice of bond sale, we include all that information so that all of the banks who want to bid on those know exactly what the terms are of that bid and when they need to have that bid turned in. Those are important documents because it's not just local banks who bid on and try to buy the county's bond issues, it's national. You know, you may have folks in Chicago or New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, who are looking to buy your bonds. So it's important to have that information out there, to have it accurate, and to make sure everybody understands what it is they're buying. Those preliminary documents are also used by Lindsay and her staff to go through the rating agency process to get, good credit rating on those bonds. Once again, that is something that helps those bonds sell at a very low interest rate. The better the credit rating, the more secure everybody believes it is, the better the outcome on that interest rate. All those documents are put together. You hold that public auction. Bids are turned in. You evaluate the bids. You award the sale to the best bidder. Best bidder is determined by the lowest interest cost on those bonds. Who are you going to have to pay the least amount of money to sell this debt? That's how the best bid is awarded. Board of County Commissioners then adopts a big, long bond resolution. If you've been through the process before, it's a 40 or 50-page document. It's got all the terms and details of the bond itself, how it's going to be repaid, the amounts, the source of funds, how the money's going to be used. That gets approved, and then the sale is formally awarded at that point. That's the end of phase two. Phase three is the closing. This is the important part. This is when you actually get the money in the bank from that bond sale. Closing usually happens 2 to 4 weeks after the sale itself. That gives our firm enough time to pull together all the documents, get everything signed, get them approved by the state attorney general, get the bonds registered by the state treasurer, get the bonds shipped to the purchaser in advance of closing. And then once closing occurs, usually what happens at that point is the bank who won wires the money to the county's bank account. The county releases possession of the bonds to the purchaser, and the deal's closed. That money's now in your account, so you can use it for the project that bond is being issued for. If you've already spent money on that project, you can use it to reimburse some of those costs. If you're issuing the bond to refund an earlier bond, you can use that money to pay off that earlier bond, kind of like a refinancing of a mortgage. But basically, at closing, that's when that money then transfers to your account, and it becomes available for you to use. Obviously, after that, the repayment happens accordance with the interest rates and principal amounts that are set out in that bond resolution. But in essence, that's kind of the process from start to finish, authorization to money in the bank. It can take anywhere from 2 to 6 months, depending on the type of the project or projects that may be in there, and if they require an election or that sort of thing. So that's why it's always kind of important to kind of keep some of those big picture timelines in mind. That's why I really appreciate the relationship that we have with Finance and Public Works, and they do a very good job of kind of letting us know the capital improvement plans and what the county may be cash financing. and what they may need to issue bonds for, so that we can get some of those early steps in process, so that when the county says it's time to go, prelim work's already been taken care of, and then you can just move on. I'm going to pause here for a second. Are there any questions about anything that I've talked about so far? Okay. I'm going to get into a little bit more detail then, if we have a couple minutes, on basically the specifics of some of the different types of authorizations and the different types of projects that the county can authorize the issuance of bonds for. So something to keep in mind also when we talk about authorizing, and the county takes action to authorize those bonds, that doesn't mean that it's a requirement that you then must go ahead and issue the bonds. It simply authorizes it under state law, and it preserves your right down the road to issue those bonds for federal tax purposes. So it is literally what it says. It's an authorization. It's not a requirement. And so one of the things that we always try to do is, like I said, get a good idea of the different types of projects that the county may be looking to authorize, and to try to find some convenient ways for the county to be able to move down that path. One of the things that we've done is, in conversation with county staff, is that there are needs for potentially for county buildings or county facilities in the future. And especially, with regards to the Public Building Commission and some of the limitations on its future use and those leases and inability, well, not an inability, but a hardship on some of those leases and the repayments, along with the expiration of the county's old charter. One of the things we looked at is a way to try to find under state law a method for the county to be able to authorize the issuance of bonds for large-scale building projects to the extent necessary. Due to the county's promotion, I guess, to an urban area county a few years ago, that opened up a few new avenues that were not previously available. And so one of those, we were able to work with staff to prepare this charter resolution number 69 that was adopted last year. It provides flexibility to the county. So now, in essence, when you want to and when you're ready to, you can finance the acquisition of sites for county buildings, structures, or parking improvements. You can finance improvements and prep to those sites to get them ready. And then you can also finance basically the improvement, construction, renovation, of new buildings on those sites, or renovations of existing buildings on those sites. So really, it provides some broad flexibility to the county commission going forward, and it's something that could be very useful on future projects. As I mentioned, it's not a requirement. It's an authorization. It's one tool in the toolbox. It also has a little bit, when I talk about flexibility, it also has a little bit of flexibility in that it's not limited in location like the prior charter was. The prior charter was for county courthouse complex improvements. That was defined as the downtown courthouse and anything within a 3-block radius of that. That was a function of the state law that was chartered to give the county that authority. This new charter under the urban area county law, it does not have that similar location requirement. So in essence, it's really anywhere in the county is a place that this could be used. So that provides some flexibility on that part. Wanted to make sure to kind of go over that, since that is something that is new, since I was last up here at one of these retreats a couple years ago, so I wanted to make sure to talk about that. With that being said, that's kind of the broad overview. Lindsay, are there any specific things that you had in mind that you wanted me to touch base on?
No, this is exactly it. I guess the only thing I would ask is, because I know we're going to get into it,
Okay.
do we have the debt financing policy, which is what we're going to kind of do a deep dive on next?
Yeah.
I'm not following my own instructions. I didn't have my- Sorry. Being a hypocrite. Okay, sorry. So I know it's going to come up in our discussion next about the debt policy itself, but we have those 5 benchmark ratios that we use right now to limit how much debt we have. We also, of course, have a state legal limit. I guess in your opinion, because I know we talked about this before, do you have any concerns about the policy? We're talking about cracking it open again as a part of this discussion, would there be anything off the top of your head that you would want us to look at, or you feel pretty comfortable with the policy as it is generally?
Yeah, I think overall, it's probably a good idea to have that policy. So under state law, in essence, they set kind of a floor as to how much debt cities and counties can have. So cities, it's 30% of an assessed valuation figure. For counties, it's 3% of your assessed valuation. That's the amount of general obligation debt that a county can have outstanding. So lease purchases don't count against that. Revenue bonds don't count against that. And even not all general obligation debt counts against that. If it's for certain specific types of projects, the state has said these are important enough that even if a city or a county doesn't have debt limit authority otherwise to issue these bonds, we think these projects are important enough. We want to go ahead and say that you can do them regardless of the debt limit. But generally speaking, 3% of the county's assessed valuation, that is your debt limit. So that's kind of the benchmark that applies to everybody. I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea for the county to go above and beyond that and say, well, that's nice, but we also want to have some internal controls to make sure that there's just not a lot of, overabundance of debt that gets issued because, well, okay, that's easy, let's go ahead and do it. That may not be the best reason to do it. So I think it makes sense to have that internal policy and to set those benchmarks. I think it's also important to have kind of what you have built into there where it's, it doesn't have to meet every one of the criteria because, as we've talked about, one of those criteria is overlapping debt. So it's good to take into account from the county's perspective, if you're Jane Smith living in Sedgwick County, you're not just worried about how much debt does the county have, you also might live in the city of Wichita. So how much debt does the city of Wichita have? And you might be in USD 259 school district. So how much debt does the school district have? Because at the end of the day, that's all going to apply to you if you're within those boundaries. So having that as part of the process is important to keep in mind also. But once again, that's also one of the things that some of that is outside of your control. The county can control the county, but you really can't control how much debt some of the other folks inside the county issue, for their needs. So it's good to keep that in mind. And it's good to have that so that you can keep an eyeball on that. I think overall it's good to have that internal policy. Now where the exact numbers need to be, that's way outside of my ballpark. But I think overall though it's good and it's good management to have that. Yep. Okay. Any questions? That would not be the first time I've talked about bonds and I haven't had any questions, so don't feel bad about it. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Appreciate you having me out here. And if there, afterwards, if you think of something or if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with Lindsay, and she can pass those along to me and we can discuss further as necessary. But I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay now.
Thank you very much, Garth. Okay, and you said you'll be able to stick around for a little bit, right? Okay. So we're going to go really quickly through these first few slides. I'm going to be like Jim Weber and have a lengthy presentation, but go quick. So, as Garth explained, we have state law. We have rules and authorizations that we're able to do as a county. But then the commission has gone further and has set a policy that tells us how we can administer debt. So we're going to go quick because I know this is not the most exciting thing on a Friday when it's sunny outside, finally. So the purpose of our debt policy is outlined at the very beginning. We obtain financing when we have to. It sets a process. Whoa, hi.
You're okay. I'm just going to zoom in. Keep going.
I can't, I don't have a microphone. Okay, 6 feet away. Okay, so we obtain financing only when we have to. It gives us a process by which we have to follow. And so it actually outlines it in some specificity. And of course, it makes sure that we are guaranteeing good financial management for the county. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, because we have that fiduciary responsibility. So as Garth explained, we have certain types of debt that we're allowed to issue legally. So this policy contemplates doing general obligation bonds. We really like general obligation bonds because it only requires a 3-2 vote of the commission. It's a lot simpler, and we get the very best possible interest rates under this approach. There are special assessment bonds. So when you have a benefit district, maybe one of your areas in your community wants to come out and get some sewer and some road and some other things done, they can get essentially an improvement district. There's a process that actually our lovely Public Works Department will administer for us to go through and evaluate that, get some cost estimates and everything, and then essentially the county issues the bonds, but then those folks repay those bonds to us to cover the vast majority of those costs. There are the revenue bonds that Garth mentioned. For us, that really means PBC. And then there's a few others that are listed here just because we want to preserve the right to do them. Temporary notes, which are essentially ways to float you some cash in the short term if you can't meet your obligations. We really don't ever want to be in a position where we have to do that, but this policy would allow it if we're ever in that position. Lease purchase agreements, we do some of those on the fire district side. Again, that's a separate legal entity. The county doesn't do that. We have the cash typically to cover these expenses for the types of things we would do here, and we don't really like to do them because we pay interest. And if we can do it without that, that's all that much better. And then the policy also allows us to do anything else that would be legally authorized under the law. So we do restrict what we can use financing for. And everybody else, Brent and Garth, say financing the fancy way. I can't say it that way, so you're going to have to deal with my way of saying it that's far less eloquent. But we can only purchase capital assets that we cannot otherwise fund. We don't have the cash on hand to do it. And that was what Garth was talking about on the cash basis law front. We can use it for one-time capital improvement projects, and the useful life of those assets has to extend beyond the term that we repay. So if we're buying something and it's only good for 10 years, we're not going to debt finance it for more than 10 years. That wouldn't make any sense, and it would be against policy. So the policy outlines right now how we have to go through that. The steps debt issuances must meet before we would actually encourage you to go forth with them. So step one is the project has to be in our 5-year CIP. So each year when you adopt a budget, you adopt a 5-year capital improvement plan. It has to be in there. Or it has to involve something that, again, we can't pay for unless we maybe have an unacceptable property tax hike. That is with some latitude, that's some objective language in that policy, and we'd have to talk about what that means. And then finally, if something pops up that we simply can't plan for, something that comes to mind for me is Project Eclipse, the Spirit building that was done a few years ago. That wasn't in our capital improvement plan, but we didn't have $7 million of cash that we had laying around that we were comfortable with outlaying. And so we issued debt for that. But we did do a shortened term. That's only over 10 years. And then the second step in that analysis, both of these criteria must be met. Again, the project life has to meet at least the repayment term. And then we have to have revenues to pay the debt service. And so when we talk about debt service, that's just your installment payment every year, right? Just like if you have a credit card, we have the same thing for our repayment terms. So the policy also goes so far as to tell us when should we pay as you go, meaning cash, versus when should we debt fund. And so looking at this slide, this outlines for you when that would come into place. We've got the money, it can be done quickly. If we get more debt, it's going to either impact our ability to pay that debt, or it's going to impact our credit rating, or let's say the market is in an absolute insane position, we absolutely have to move forward and we go ahead and use cash to get some kind of necessary equipment or project. Long-term debt is appropriate when we have the money to pay the debt service. When market conditions allow us to get decent interest rates, if a project is mandated by the state or federal government, as we've already discussed, there are certain opportunities for those things to come up. The project is required now, and we don't have the cash to cover it, and the project is at least 5 years or longer. So generally, we've talked about this recently the last 2 years. For most of our payments, we want to do a 20-year term, except for special assessments. The policy says that we'll stick with 15 years. We did have one exception recently, and And we've taken some corrective action to make sure that anybody who comes along later knows that it's 15 years, and that 20-year option isn't necessarily going to be readily available. One of the things that I think is pretty cool about what we do, and I know it's super nerdy to say anything's cool about bond financing, but we pay off 30% of our principal in the first 5 years of a 20-year term, and we pay off 60% in the first 10 years. And so that reduces how much we have to pay, that reduces how much interest we're paying over the rest of the term, and so that's why you'll see when we present bonds to you, we're never gonna tell you what a specific dollar amount is, because it will depend, especially for the first 10 years and then the second 10 years. We pay all of this out of the bond and interest fund, which is one of the 8 funds listed on your long sheet that Lorian talked with you about. The policy says that we will use bond counsel for every issuance, and we will use, the policy uses the term called financial advisor. They have since been renamed municipal advisors. And so we do that to make sure, again, that we are complying with everything we possibly can to ensure good long-term fiduciary responsibility for the county. And then, like I said, it does approve certain other types of financing that we don't really like, we don't really want to do, but it allows us to do that, and it sets some parameters to do that. I don't really want to get into that today unless you just really want to. So then there are a few other highlights in the policy before we get into the real meat and potatoes of what we're talking about today. Basically, we can refund bonds, we can refinance. So let's say we issued a bond when interest rates were around 4.5%, and like we saw this year, interest rates dropped to 1.5%. If there is an opportunity for us to have enough of a savings to go through the costs and administrative headache, we'll go ahead and take advantage of that. And so this policy outlines what we have to do. And then there's arbitrage, which I really don't even want to talk about because it's so boring. But it essentially allows us to, or prevents us from profiting by refunding or continuing to do debt. And so we don't do it so we can avoid penalty. And then credit ratings, we have to have good credit ratings as a part of the policy if we proceed. The policy says the CFO is the one who has to decide how many credit ratings we need and if we even need one, because if we're going to do a small issue, maybe it's not worth it. And of course, I have to take advantage of this opportunity to brag about our current credit ratings, right? Because I actively cheer. We have a AAA from Standard & Poor's. We have technically a AAA from Moody's, but it looks funny. And then dumb old Fitch bumped us down here a few years ago to a AA+. And that was not because of any action taken on behalf of the commission. It was not anything that this commission could have done anything about. It was because of the way our economy looks. So that's the only one where we don't have an absolutely perfect score, but it's still an A. So here's what we really need to talk about. And this was the source of the discussion about the target mill levy rate resolution earlier. Within the policy, we have 5 limits in place before we can issue debt. And we have to look at each of these every time. They're just ratios. So at least 3 of these 4 on this slide need to be below the limit for the life of the term, or else we can't issue the debt. So the first one is the per capita debt. So how much debt does the county have per person? We need that to be below $500. Then, as Garth was talking about the overlapping debt, we look at that same debt, but for everybody. How much is the debt burden on each of our citizens in the entire community for every taxing entity? That is not supposed to exceed $3,000. This is the one where you will see it pops out, and it always pops out in every debt issuance discussion we have. The next one is a percentage value. Again, it looks at the county's debt relative to the full market value of property in the county, and it sets a limit of 1.5% for our own debt. Then, just like with the last measure, it looks at the debt in the entire community. That can't exceed 6%. So we'll look at the specific debt table here in a minute. But we do have a fifth standalone measure. And this was another action that was taken back in 2016 as a part of the debt policy. This one may never be exceeded. If this one exceeds, that stops us dead in our tracks. And that is where it takes our debt service, how much we repay in debt every year, relative to our total budgeted general fund and debt service fund expenses. It can never exceed 10%. If it does, it's off. So if we look at those ratios based on what the CIP was that was most recently approved the last August, again, it's that per capita debt for all taxing entities, that what's technically called underlying and overlapping debt, that we're really out of whack on. But look at the row above that. The county's per capita direct debt is $156 in 2021. That is included in the $3,618 figure. So what that tells you is roughly $3,450 on each citizen's basic tax burden that year is outside of the county. That's school districts, or that's cities, maybe townships, but probably school districts and cities. I just think that's an absolutely crazy thing to see. But then you can look at our other measures, even the one that takes all taxing entities' debt relative to how much the value is of our property, and we're still well below that benchmark ratio. And then you can see we continue to be well below that 10% mark of projected annual budgeted expenditures for our general fund and debt service. So this has been a source of discussion multiple times over the last year when we've issued debt. I know Commissioner Howell also had some questions about the ratios themselves. And so we had promised to have this discussion at this workshop because if we want to talk about making changes, we sure can. These are some of the adjustments maybe we could make. We can either add or remove benchmarks. We can talk about making them all standalone or removing some as standalone. We can modify those ratios. We can define computations. But what I would tell you is our current policy has been cited in our credit rating agency reports. We have been lauded for our good debt management. And so what we have now is not necessarily broken. It's just a matter of if there's preference. There are other considerations we would need to take into account. We do have, Chairman.
Lindsay, this 3,000 per entity, is that the county policy or is that a state law or something?
That is just our policy.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to note that my memory on the city side, there's a tremendous amount of debt for the water system that's paid for by water bills. $500 million, if I recall, recently. There's another couple $100 million debt at the airport, which is guaranteed by airport fees and parking and things like that. So I would be for moving that number up because it's really not we could do a deep dive on it, but I don't think it's a fair. I commend the $150 or $160 for the county portion of it. That's good for us, but it's misleading, I think, to say that, not misleading, but and then the school bonds are all over the place. I mean, there's bond issues that are affecting, Andover does a bond issue, and it's affecting a whole lot of citizens in Sedgwick County. And Goddard does theirs, everybody's, so I'm not sure what value that category, that entity, that category even has, unless it affects a positive or negative way on our bond rating. So, frankly, I'd just soon get rid of it or expand it, unless we'd be advised otherwise. I'm just sharing that with my fellow commissioners and everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of agree with that. The $3,000 doesn't make any sense for us to keep that. But I think that it's important that we brief it each time, because the public needs to know what the total burden is that they're facing. So I think if there's some way that we can say per capita debt for all taxing entities, and then just put NA there for max policy, but then break out so that the public knows at the time we're passing this, break out who the other people are that equals that $3,618, because I don't think they really realize where all their tax burden is. So I think it's something to keep. I don't think it's something that we should be evaluating when we're only $156 of that total debt. But I think the public still needs to know about it. Thank you.
I somewhat agree with the chairman, but I would, rather than taking this off of here, or should say, you want to increase the threshold, I think maybe you should add something to this chart. It should be the same thing, but you might want to calculate what is the debt that's taken on by the governing body that is not based on utilities, airport, or special assessments. So if you calculate that, I think that's a more relevant number. In other words, what's the tax burden? Decisions for things like buildings and infrastructure that the taxpayers are ultimately going to have to pay for. I think it's not excise fees. It's not. I think you make a good point. People who fly get paid for that. Yeah, you're right. If you talk to someone in Wichita about their debt, you can look at it one way. It's over $1 billion, but when you take out the airport, take out the water, and take out the special assessments, it's much less. And I think when you talk to someone from city council, they would rather talk about the smaller number, which I understand that. The other number is still real, but it's paid for by fees. If you fly or if you use water, then you're going to use those. You're going to pay for those debts as you use those things. So anyway, I can see changing the threshold on that based on your idea. But I think maybe a more relevant thing to add to this list would be, what is the other debt, the obligation debt that city councils and school board members and county commission and townships and others, what's the debt that we take on for things like buildings and infrastructure? I think that's another number, and I think there should be a smaller threshold in that case, because it's going to be a much smaller number. It won't be 3618. It might be $1,500 or something. I don't know what that number would be. We need to probably see what that number is, and then maybe find a reasonable threshold to use as a trigger. That's just my idea. Thank you.
Okay.
I don't disagree with maybe breaking it down a little bit, as Commissioner Dennis was saying, but that might be very difficult because school debt, we have school debt all over all 500,000 citizens, and it's not the same. But maybe there's a general school debt number you could throw in there collectively. I don't know if that's whatever. I just don't want to confuse it. Go ahead.
Well, I agree. I don't think we need to get it extremely detailed, but it comes up as a question every time. Every time that we pass debt, why? What is that? And who all is it contributing to that? So somehow we need that breakout so that the question doesn't come up each time. You'll just answer it automatically.
Sure. And I think we can easily do that just even in the, before we get the policy changed. I still think we can go ahead and explain that. All of that backup data comes from comprehensive annual financial reports. It's loaded in a spreadsheet, so we can share that spreadsheet and somehow find a way to make that easily explainable to the public in that agenda item to answer that question.
I do have just one question. So the fifth standalone benchmark was added in 16?
So the measure had been there before, but it wasn't standalone, and it had been 20%. Then it was bumped down to 9% for 2 years, and then 8% thereafter, and as a standalone measure. And then when it was amended in 2017, it stayed as a standalone measure, but it went up to 10%.
Okay,
Sorry.
so we're at okay, trying to figure this out. 6.3% as of 2021. had that been a lot higher in the past? Is that why that was put in, or?
So we have not done any large projects in some time. This facility was a public building commission bond. Exploration Place was bond funded. The downtown, like the juvenile complex, was bond funded. We just haven't done any large projects. And so, yes, over time, our debt has increased significantly. At the same time, our budget has increased. And so those two things working together have caused this percentage to go down quite a bit. But you can see that we do contemplate in 2025 there being that increase, because in the adopted CIP that had been approved, that was when we thought we would start working on financing the administration building. And so that was going to be a large, new, bond-funded expense. Okay, so we'll kind of, I just want to hit on a couple more things, then we'll wrap this up. So we do have a new charter resolution that we need to keep in mind as we go forward. If that changes any of the dynamics of our policy, we do have a capital improvement plan that we'll always need to keep in mind relative to a policy, and making sure that we have that capital improvement plan policy that operates out there in conjunction with this one. So we'll always need to consider that. As we already have talked about, the target mill levy rate resolution is tied directly to the debt policy. That was what that action was done to do. And so we still need to have some kind of resolution for that, in my opinion. We did have the property tax lid that was passed. As of today, we live under that, and as Garth explained, PBC debt is not exempt. And so thankfully, with this new charter, that solves a lot of those problems. Because before it was a 3-mile limit around the county courthouse where we could do general obligation debt. Everything else probably would have been handled through PBC, even if it was an EMS post maybe, that we needed to bond finance. Now we have so much more flexibility thanks to that charter and our promotion to an urban designated county. As Garth said, we do have the state debt limit that's in place. It's technically called 3% of equalized tangible valuation, and there are some exceptions that we're allowed to take into account. And so we do actually list that in the CAFR. It's a special page toward the back. And so just again, an opportunity to brag. We are only at 15%. I know, I'll do my little shimmy too. So we're at 15% of how much we can actually use of that 3%. It's pretty amazing, actually, how much capacity we would even have. So that just goes to show that our policy actually is even more restrictive than what the county would allow it, or the state would allow us to do. And based on what we're seeing from the state, that's saying something, right? So for next steps, we kind of just talked through it, identify the specific concerns that you all have. We've heard that. So now we'll go back and try and look at what options we might have to try and fix that. We'll present those to you, maybe either in 2x1s or in a staff meeting. Maybe it's both. And then we'll present a planned policy resolution to you at some point. Now, for this policy to have an effect and be a limit on the 2022 budget and any CIP we bring to you, we would need to do this by mid-June so that the county manager can use that in his decisions, because his drop dead day is what, June 20th-ish? So that's the date by which all final decisions to be included in the recommended budget have to go to print. So certainly with COVID, we know this may not be your highest priority, but we'll definitely get to work toward this goal and see what kind of consensus we can reach. And if not, it will become an issue that we deal with in the 23 budget cycle. And that would give us a little extra time. So any questions or anything I can answer on this particular topic?
I guess I'd like to make a couple of comments. Thank you. So, you know, I wanted to say that several commissioners were on this board when we changed this debt policy back in the past, and there was an effort to trying to have less reliance on debt. And some of the words in here are, in my opinion, are very interesting words because, for example, on page 4 it says, shall be used only to purchase capital assets that cannot be acquired from from either available current revenues or fund balances. And one-time capital improvement projects and unusual equipment purchases. Those are interesting words because I know some municipalities do use similar practices of Sedgwick County where we do kind of, I would call it routine borrowing for our bridge programs at $4 million a year, and I'm sure it's going to be in the budget again this year. There was an effort back in 2016 and 2017 to move away from that practice, and we actually, the way we did it was a couple of things. We borrowed from ourselves. We had some surplus cash. We reduced how much money we would put into that CIP for those bridges that 1 year. In fact, I think over 2 years, we pulled $1 million of surplus cash over to that, and we reduced how much money we spent in that bridge program a couple of years, and the result of that was really remarkable. The numbers were really impressive, how fast we would have gotten out of debt. But we've gone back in the other direction, and I know our budget's more challenging right now than it was in 2017, or 16. So maybe this is a moot point. But at the time, we thought the debt limit had been up over 12%, or maybe 13 or 14%. I mean, it was pretty high, and we captured, I guess, a desire. We just wanted to say is a desire of Sedgwick County not to rely on debt too much. And since we could get down to that 8%, in fact, we got down below, I think, the 8% for a short time there. Now we're back up to, what's our number today? It's on
Actually,
the
we're
sheet.
down below 8.
Yeah, it's now actually down below 8 now. It's
Down
even on the
below
sheet
6.
there. Right. So that was a very robust discussion, and I think that everyone recognized that if you need something, if it's an emergency, of course, you need to go ahead and just do it because it's an issue of safety. It's an issue of you have to provide for, things that are worn out and end of life. And if it comes down to safety issues, then you certainly have to fund that. I also have been very much on record saying I support these larger, unique things like the Project Eclipse, for example. Or if an admin building needs to use debt, I would be supportive of that. And I've been consistent in this. The one thing I've not really enjoyed is the idea that we kind of use this routine $4 million per year. That pipeline has $4 million bond in there. It's 20 years long, so it's, correct me if I'm wrong, that's $80 million
Over 20 years?
over that 20 years. And if you think about it, back 20 years ago, I was just wondering who was a commissioner back then. It's interesting. I'm gonna put that number. Tim Norton wasn't even elected back then. That's how long ago that was. Okay, it was back when Betsy Goon was on the board. So we're just now paying off those bonds. And if something is worn out and it's not safe, I support it. I think it's good policy. We should use debt in those situations. If it's something really large and unique, like an administration building, I think it's reasonable to say we should use debt for those because it's almost multi-generational. And those are very large projects that require a lot of investment, a lot of time to take care of it. Interest Bank Arena obviously was voter approved. That we actually cash funded that. We saved up and paid for it, which was interesting. Most municipalities would have never done that. That was a remarkable way to do that. And this building, of course, was PBC debt, but I think it was an investment, and it was something that I think that was very very difficult for the commission to make that decision, but they made the right decision, and I would have supported this as well. At the end of the day, that $4 million was the point of contention, and we were kind of climbing out of that hole. But again, if we have bridges that need to be replaced, I use the word need judiciously, if they need to be replaced, then I think we should replace them. But if they have some life left in them, when I say bridges, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure Jim's probably in the room behind me.
He is.
I would say probably somewhere between 8 and 13, 15, bridges a year kind of fall into this $4 million CIP. Some of these bridges are $50,000. They're small township bridges. Some of them are a little bit more than that. But I don't know how to assess those bridges. If they're 50% sufficiency rating, if that's something that can push off a couple of years, maybe that's a way to kind of maybe not rely on debt. If they're unsafe, then I think it crosses a line. And I don't know how we can inspect those bridges and know that for sure, but we want to be conservative and careful. We don't want someone to get hurt by using something a little too long. But again, if something's got, 50% sufficiency rating on it, I don't know that it's something we should be replacing at that time. If we can push it off a little bit longer, it helps us not rely on debt too much for this type of spending. So I just wanted to share that with my colleagues because I know there's going to be some discussion about changing this 10% to back to 12%, which was what we did in 2017, a huge debate. We settled on 10. Some commissioners wanted 12, some commissioners wanted 8 or 9. We settled on 10 as a compromise, but I'm not sure everybody was happy with that. And anyway, I just think that to use routine borrowing is not something every municipality does not do that. Some of them do, but not all of them. And so this idea of just borrowing money routinely is my concern. And obviously Jim wants to probably comment. Thank you.
Yeah, so just real briefly, we have routinely borrowed for roads and bridges. We are, as we're going forward, and Lynn Packer's working on the CIP right now, but we're saying, where David Spears wanted to do $4 million every time we went out, we're saying that's the last number we're going to add in is the bonded piece, sort of the makeup piece. We are looking at really making sure we're drilling in on the right bridges to do, and we are switching up and doing more major repair work instead of replacements. And so that very long-term impact. We're sensitive to the fact that this is debt that's added on. And as you can imagine, we had multiple conversations with Commissioner Ranza at the time. He was producing spreadsheets and it was quite an exercise, but we understand the problem. And I think the problem is making the switch. And that's what we said previously. It's like, we can do this, but if bonds are out for 20 years, there is a need for some kind of cash to replace it, maybe not 100% of it. So that's been the challenge. And the other thing I will mention, there's about $1.6 million a year comes out of the sales tax that's paying the debt on those $4 million, which is kind of why there's if you could switch over, you could probably get there, but it's the switch over that's the problem. So we're sensitive to the issue, and I think going forward, we're trying to only bond what we need to bond, or think we need to bond. And I'll get out of the way so you can move on.
Okay, so that is all we have for the debt policy discussion, unless there's specific questions. Otherwise, I think I have a feel for what to do next, and you'll be hearing more on that. So with that, then, we will transition to the next step, and this is solely up to the commissioners about how much time you want to actually take. We had earmarked about an hour of time for you all to be able to share your priorities, or alternatively, if you had specific topics you wanted to bring up at workshops, we can certainly make arrangements for that. The other alternative would be to put this off to a Tuesday staff meeting if you've had just about as much as you can take today, which I can fully understand, and we can pick it up from there. It just would be very helpful to staff to know sooner rather than later what are maybe some high priority issues that you need information on, so that we can prepare and get that to you in a timely fashion, just knowing how many other challenges we have in this budget process.
Lindsay, some of the commissioners need a quick break.
Okay.
I had thought we were out at noon today, so I had an appointment at noon, but I wouldn't mind if we want to take a 5-minute break, and then if anybody wants to, we come back and share 5 or 6 minutes of observation. It's a lot to digest, especially for Sarah. Budget comments might be good for a workshop environment, staff meeting. It might, because we might, some of it might be, you might feel rushed to comment and not have a chance to maybe talk to some staff and get a little bit more information. I'm open for suggestions, but we do have Tom. Okay.
Thanks, Chairman. An option I would throw out, because time is of the essence, is that Tuesday we could discuss this. That gives everybody a chance to digest what they've heard and ask some offline questions, and then we come back together Tuesday morning at 9 and have this this is really important, what we're gonna do here. We need to hear from you. So we'd be glad to do it next Tuesday.
Okay, well, and I say that because I've written some notes about what I would maybe say in my 10 minutes, but then as I look through the whole thing again, I'm thinking, maybe this is more important than that.
And maybe you want some time to
questions
study
with
the
staff.
forecast and look long-term,
Yeah,
whatever.
and questions for, we might have individual questions with staff, leadership, roads, whatever.
Okay.
So, does that sound all right with everybody?
We'll tee it up for next Tuesday, 9 o'clock then.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Did you have any closing comments, Tom? You have any closing comments that you want to make?
No, I don't. Lindsay, or anybody else have? Nope.
Well, once
Lori,
again,
anything?
it's great information. Lorian, Lindsay, thanks for your efforts. For everybody, it's very helpful. Again, it's easier the third time I've done it. What do you think, Commissioner Cruz? It's a little more, first time was a little crazy. So, okay, go ahead, Tom. Okay. All right, so let's get some more vaccines done next week too, okay?